Good morning, Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1429. So we finished the paragraph on 1429. Let's sum up what we've learned. Okay. So discussing the avodah, the work of the neshamas as they come down below, which of course is quite complicated because below everything is concealed. The way God created the world with all the tzimtzumim and the concealments, we have to work on revealing the divine within ourselves, within the world around us. So neshamas are empowered in many ways to do that. So firstly, they themselves come from original source to the highest levels of the divine, as we learned all the way from the highest levels that are higher than Torah and higher than the Shtei Shtalshus and higher than Alei Sarotzen, all the way Shmoya Atzmi, Helam Atzmi. However, the neshamas now come down into a world where they have to engage with tachtenim and all the challenges of life. And as such, they have additional resources. Torah, which is a revealed blueprint of God's will and wisdom. Torah that illuminates the way of how we should live our lives. We have the Einei Ha'eda, the leaders that are considered the eyes of the community. They serve as eyes that help illuminate as well and guide. And you have the Malachim. The Malachim is also a siyua, a support, as we've been learning. The Malachim's role is both Mamayla Lamata, to process and distribute the divine energy that comes from Atzilus into, just like the digestive system, the gut, the Me'ov, Hirvayim. That's why the Malachim are called that, to process it and draw it into existence on the terms of existence, as well as elevate that the Maisa Tachtem, the work we do, is elevated upward. Now, in this context itself, the Rebbe Rashab explained that there are different levels, because there are levels of the divine that are higher than Atzilus, where all the Maisa Tachtenim, nothing affects that place. Ani Hashem Leishan Yisi. And that's why he asked the question, Rachamim, how do you say compassion there? Compassion is simply God's power, his yichelis, his capacity to have Rachmanis, as he explained, Atzmim Shemispal, Leishemispal Min Azulas. But it's mitzada etzem. Then in Atzilus you have Ispalus already. There's an emotion, an entity called Rachamim, Tiferes, same thing, Chesed and Gevurah. But it's not affected by Tachtenim, as we discussed at length. It's still in that domain. Then comes in Biyah. That's where it engages and actually interacts with Tachtenim. And that's through Malchus of Atzilus as it manifests in Matat, the angel Matat, and from there the Hashpah continues through the Malachim, as we learned yesterday, Malachim Anikroim Einei Hashem, that both elevate in Chinas Malchus and to the Kalim of Atzilus, and also the Hashpah comes through them, as we learned earlier, Kol Hamshach is from Atzilus, and they go through the Malachim as well, who process and deliver or distribute that energy. So the Eiris of Atzilus, as he said, from Torah associates more with the idea of Yodua, it's known there, and Yodeya, which is a more engaging awareness and knowledge, as when we're on the same level, not looking from the bird's eye view. That's as it manifests in the Kalim of Atzilus. And that's how he explained that this is what it means when we say Hamu Mei Eloi Arachem Arachmenu. That Rachamim, that is engages with existence, goes through Hamu, the feeling of Hamiyah, strong emotion that leads to that brings on the compassion, relates to Mei. And Mei are the innards. That's the gut, the intestines that refer to these angels that draw down that Rachamim in a way that relates to us. And he connected also to the pasuk in Shir Hashir, Me'ov Eshes Shein, that the abdomen, that part of the Me'ov, is hard, is like a hard slab of ivory, So he said, explain that that's the level of the 12 Shvatim, which connects to the 12 Mazoles, which are rooted in the 12 cattle or ox, in the Shlomo Melech, when he created the base, built the Beis Hamikdash with a river, with the ocean, with the Yam, the river or the ocean above, the sea above them. That imagery is the level of the Yud Gimel Midas Harachimim from Atik of Bria. So it's all consistent with the same idea. Meyav, that draws down Esher Shein, that from there comes that that draws down the Midas Harachimim from Atik of Bria. And the final thing we learned briefly, and we're going to learn more about it later, just to put it in context of davening, this is when we say Melech Yochid Chei Elamim at the end of when we say the Yishtabach, that's the level of Atik, and then comes after that Birchas Yetzer, which talks about the Malachim. We say B'Rachamecha Rabim Rachem Aleinu. We're going to get back to that and how that fits into this whole context. But the bottom line is that we're talking about a level that has now brings down and relates to existence. So in the words he used, the Shinui and Hispilus, that's in Malchus of Atzilus, but not higher than Malchus. It affects the Kelim of Atzilus, like we said, Yedeya, not just Yedua, but primarily Malchus, and as Malchus manifests in Matat. So the next piece now is going to be a longer explanation of how this works. What are the dynamics of Malchus? How Malchus serves as this interface where God's supervision and guidance of existence interacts with existence in a way that it affects it. Or to use the example I was giving, the king sends his ministers and his appointees to govern his empire, each one in their municipality, in their city, and their area. So they are basically serving as the eyes, the supervisors, and the appointees of the king to guide and direct those cities and make sure it's aligned with the king's wishes. And it goes both ways. The king sending his messages to the people, and the people sending their messages to the king, their requests. So it's the Malachim that serve as these so-called ministers or these ambassadors and agents all over in the worlds of Biyah, Bri, Yitzir, Asiya, that serve this role. And that's where there's the real interaction between existence and the divine in a way that's on our terms, which means there's a certain, like he said, Hispilus and Shinui. So to explain this dynamic is now going to be the next section, which is going to go, again, quite a few pages. But it's all helping explain and just put it a little into context. The context here, going back to the central theme of Ayin Beis. So you may recall I reviewed it a few times. In the first volume, primarily what the Rebbe Rashab laid out was the building blocks and the map of Seder Shtalshus of existence. Beginning with, first he started with Chesed, the transcendent energy, but then immediately went to understand the immanent energy of the 10 spheres, as they're rooted in the highest levels before the Tzimtzum, as the sphere of Sagnuzis, the Koyach HaGvul, the Eir HaGvul, of God's power to emanate in a structural way. And then he went back to understand the transcendent energy of Chesed, and ultimately the goal being is joining these two together, where the transcendent is interfaced and fused together with the immanent, the divine beyond existence with the divine within existence. It's a central theme through volume 1. The Eir HaBlikvul, the Eir HaGvul, Oves, Matan Teira, with the Eir HaBlikvul being Eir Chadash, a new unprecedented energy. In volume 2, when he started talking about Aramimcha Lekaya Melech, both Mamata L'mayla Mayla, actually begins at the end of volume 1. Whether you're bringing Aramimcha from the top down through Teira, or you're elevating Lekaya Melech, the divine within existence, Malchus, to elevate it to Aramimcha. So he discussed those two forms. That's when he began to introduce the concept of Tzimtzumim. Even though the Tzimtzum is mentioned in volume 1, but Tzimtzum and Parsa becomes a very central theme in volume 2, because he's talking about how that energy comes from these higher levels, how do they actually come downward? And Malchus plays a very vital role, especially in the beginning of volume 2, Aramimcha Lekai HaMelech, Malchus, because Malchus is that interface in Atzilus itself between Atzilus and Biyah. There's the Malchus within Atzilus, there's the Malchus as it enters into Biyah through the Parsa, the partition in between. And there we spoke about how Malchus is Knesset Yisrael and Shoshana, like we learned here. Shoshana, the rose that changes colors. So Malchus has the element of change in it because Malchus plays that central role. So reading it here, it brings back all those pages and pages where the Rebbe Rashab elaborated on Malchus being that interface, and it's definitely connected to everything we're learning here. But after he explains how Malchus enters below the Parsa, that's when the big question arises in the Torah of the Magid. It's one thing to connect Atzilus to godliness, to Ein Sof higher than Atzilus, because Atzilus at the end of the day, even though it's a structure, but it's divine, like we learned. It's all about the divine expression. It's all about divine capabilities. It's not yet engaged with existence, as we know it in Biyah. But how do you connect existence after the Parsa, after the partition, which is similar to the Tzimtzum Arishin, when you talk in macrocosm, between Atzilus the Klolos, Atzilus and macrocosm, to Bria the Klolos, which is Ak. How do you bring the divine into that reality, into the post-Tzimtzum or post-Parsa reality? And that's when began a long discussion about that we can't bypass the Tzimtzum, we can't surrender to it, we have to transform it, because the whole purpose of the Tzimtzum is Gili, like we learned a bit earlier here as well. That's part of the process, that's part of the Isbonanus that we talk about when we talk about Habayruch Be'echad, in unifying existence with the divine. And he also brought it in context when he said that Rachamim and Atzilus is the joining of the Tzimtzum and Gilach, Chesed and Gevurah, God's power to reveal and God's power to conceal, understanding how they are interconnected. So that's a big theme back in middle of volume 2 that goes through volume 2, and volume 3 goes even deeper. Einoid, not just v'yadaita yem v'shavesa levecha ke'avayo lekim shemayim mal va'aretz metachas, but also einoid, that the very Tzimtzum itself is also the divine power coming from the Helam Ha'atzmi, the power to conceal. So when you come now back to this discussion here, where here he's talking about, started with Torah, Torah coming down, Torah drawing down from Arimimcha Keser into Melech, into Lekai Melech Malchus. So it becomes quite obvious the connection to the whole general theme, because then he speaks about Torah and speaks about Ner Mitzvah V'Torah Er, and speaks about the neshamas that are higher than Torah and neshamas that are lower than Torah, Mekabel from Torah, as well as Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, which brought us all to the three types of Er Mekabel, the moonlight, the luminous stone, and the vision of the eye, and the two levels of the vision of the eye, the way the power of vision is within the eye and it's limited. Like the neshama says, they come down below and they need an external light, the Torah Malachim, to support and allow them to see clearly and to serve properly. And then there's the vision as it is in its core root, Etzem Kayach Hariyah, where there doesn't have these limitations. And obviously we want to join the two. So when you bring it all together, now that he's talking about how the neshamas come down below, and this we're talking now from Malchus into Biyah, and now the Malchus is a place that where the divine engages with existence, Alekai Melech. Like I said, Amimcha Lekai Melech. It's Malchus is engaging with existence. So this isn't just a tangential point, it's the central theme of Ayin Beis. So now we're entering, we spoke earlier about how things are before the Tzimtzum in the highest levels. Now he's coming back down after the Tzimtzum. So if you really think about it, it's like joining volume 1 and volume 2. He's talking both about the divine before the Tzimtzum, the higher levels, then talks about how the divine comes down within existence. And that's what we're right now addressing from the point of view of Avodah, how Maisa Tachtenim, like he put it, is Negeya. Negeya, where is it? Nikra, Negeya, it's in Malchus as it manifests in Matat, and then goes down into Biyah. And that's where that engagement takes place. So really the central point that I want to make here is that what we're learning right now is understanding the process of how things work down below, where the energy is processed and the energy is through the Malachim and Meyov is coming into existence and engaging with existence. And then that's going to help us understand the yichud that with that. Once we understand how the divine engages with us, then we elevate it all. That we elevated it all upward to understand how the divine is beyond existence. The levels that we learned, Atzilus, and then higher than Atzilus, and then all the way up to Lifnei Hatzimtzum, Aleis HaRatzon, Kedem Aleis HaRatzon, all the way to Shmaya Atzmi, all the way to the Helam Atzmi. So that's the context, just to keep things, to understand the whole context of what we're discussing now. I hope you have followed this. I did it quite densely and briefly, but since we've spoken about it a number of times, I thought I don't need to elaborate more. But if I do, you'll let me know. But now we're going to learn, so now we're going to go now into more nitty-gritty of how Malchus, how Malchus engages with existence, which creates an interface on that level, and then we're going to elevate it all back to the neshamas are going to elevate it all the way to the higher levels. But now we're talking about how it's now in Malchus and below. Okay, so that's somewhat of a overview. If we're ready, unless somebody wants to ask something, I'll start the new paragraph. So here we go. So on page 1429, on the new paragraph of Bir Inyan Hanal, and to explain the subject matter that we learned earlier, and the Rebbe Rashab actually tells us what is the Inyan Hanal. The Shine Shech Rag B'Bchinas Malchus. That a shift and change in the divine energy is not in Atzilus and higher than Atzilus, is Dafke Malchus, Rak B'Bchinas Malchus. U'kamoisha mislabeshes b'matat. And as Malchus manifests in Matat, which is like a garment that, an additional garment that Malchus manifests in. Mashenkin b'lamayla ma Malchus. By contrast, that which is higher than Malchus, there is no shinui. Hagam she'ashpa himel maila. Even though the ashpa is coming from there. Like we said, the ashpa always comes from Atzilus. The food is coming from when the food and the sustenance is coming from a higher place, generated by Araveda. But the hashpa itself remains, like he said, in a state of Ein Sof and Bligvul. That's why you need Meyav, you need Kervayim, you need the digestive system, the gut, to process that energy from Atzilus into Biyah. And that's the process that goes through Malchus as it manifests in Matat. So even though the Hashpah originates, doesn't come from the Malachim, the Hashpah. They're just the ambassadors. They're just the agents that carry. They're the, if you wish, the mailmen that deliver it. But so the shinui happens in the level of the processing and the level of the delivery, not the source, where the Hashpah is coming from. Even though, as I explained yesterday, and we will explain and discuss, our Aveda affects and generates that energy. He referred to it also on the previous page and said, Kamoshi is Bayer. So there's more to talk about this topic. But the energy in Atzilus, higher than Malchus, rather, I should say, or anything higher than Malchus, is not impacted. And like you said, the words were not, it does not impacted by the involvements and the engagements of existence. And now he's going to explain what that is. That's would be the Inyan Hanal. So the parentheses qualifies what exactly the Rebbe Rashab is going to be explaining now. So explaining be it Inyan Hanal, Yuvon al pi ma shekosu b'mokem acher. We'll understand it according to what it says elsewhere. Al Maimer HaZayar, on the statement in the Zayar, Vayera Kuftes Amid Beis. They introduce a Zayar, a beer on the Zayar. And this is actually, where is this? If you want to know the source, is Biyuri Hazer of the Tzemach Tzedek, volume 1, page 31 and on. I marked it here. It's a mimer from the Alter Rebbe from Tovkuf Samach Hey, which is the year Tovkuf Samach Hey would be 1805. And I should also add, there's more sources that I can give you. My Mortav Shandal, I see page 27 and on. And I just found also from the Mittler Rebbe, there's a Shari Tshuva, Shar HaPchira, that talks about this at length as well. So this is a beauty hazayah. What does the Zayar say? So first we'll start with the Zayar that explains a verse, the al-Posuk. The Maimon Hazayar is on the Posuk, on the verse, V'hu misibes mishapek b'tarbelesav l'folam. So this is a verse in the book of Job. I have it here in front of me. I looked it up. 37:12. So what is he talking about there? There, in Job's and Eiv's dialogue with God, so part of it is, of course, how he runs the world, because he's talking about the biggest question, suffering, the suffering of existence. Similarly, we spoke about Erdana, when it says God descends, let us descend below, because we hear the cry from Sodom is very painful. So we're seeing an engagement, how God engages with our pain and our suffering, but in general, with all the engagements of this world. So this is a part of the theme there in Eiv. So he says, so actually he talks there about a malach. The chapter, the verse 11, he speaks about the malach called Af Beri. We actually mention it when we say Geshem. This is called the angel of rain. So he's talking about how God interacts with the world. So he has his different agents, and he's mentioning the angel of rain. Remember, we learned earlier, there's the angel of the Sar Shal Chochmah, Sar Shal Mayim. He's talking about this. And then it says, and he, God, this is he, Mesibis Misapach B'Tarbeleso the Falam, literally translates, and he turns. Misapach, he turns around in circles or in circuits by his guidance for their work. In other words, God is basically maneuvering and managing existence through these different angels. And he says, he continues, I'll just read the whole post, Asher Yitzavam, Al Pnei Sevel Atza. Whatever he commands them, these angels, upon the face of the habitable world. And then he continues, whether it should be a kind transmission, Chesed, Im Chesed Yimtzu, or Limshevet, or Gevurah. Basically, as Rashi explains, that based on our Avodah, especially talking about Rosh Hashanah, that when we pray and our prayers and our merits go up to heaven, so God then makes sure that the rains and all the blessings come down into existence in the proper way, Chesed. If God forbid the lack of merits and transgressions, that brings down Hamshachah from Gevurah. So that's the theme there in Eiv. Says the Zayar, what does it mean that he turns? You know, when we say Mesapach B'Tach B'Lesav, Lefolam, he's turning something. What is he turning? So usually it's like you think of a puppeteer who's maneuvering. Obviously, we're not talking about puppets here because we have free will, but the forces, the angels, I wouldn't call them puppets, they're called programs. They're basically agents and ambassadors. So the Zayar explains what means Mesibis Mesapach B'Tach B'Lesav Lefolam. Here's the Zayar. Kutsha B'richa Mesavev Sivuvim. God turns, he's turning and maneuvering. It's like when you have someone who's running the person who's driving a ship, for example. So he's turning the wheel, he's turning the wheels, so to speak, he's turning the wheels of existence. So, because Baruch Mesavev Sivuvim Va'aisa Uvdin Liskaima. And he does all kinds of things. Va'aisa draws down and manages different actions to preserve, to sustain existence. And based on the behavior of Bnei Nasha people, he's going to explain what that means in the parentheses. Upidish be'er hachama. Eir hachama is the Ramak's interpretation, explanation of the Zayar. Va'aisa uvdim ba'alma hainu shekera haderis. What means aisa uvdim ba'alma? It means Shekeda Haderis. He establishes and foresees and the generations Ubeiram Liskayim and creates them to be and to sustain them. Kugain Deir Hamabel, like the generation of the flood. V'heim Choshru Shoyakayomim LeElam. That means Lebasa Dechshiva B'nei Nasha. The Yiskaimim. They thought that they would live forever. The Kilkul Masayim. As a result, they took for granted their blessings, and the Kilkul Masayim, and they were destructive, basically. They became decadent in their ways. Ubotlam v'hovcham makiyum elaheder. And what did God do? That's called turning Tarbalesav. That even though they thought everything is going to be fine, Botlam, he eliminated them, annihilated them. V'hovcham makiyum elaheder, and transformed them, makiyum, from existing to non-existence. Basically destroyed the world due to their sins during the time of the flood. So that's what the Zohar is saying, that when you say Mesibus Mesabach B'Tag B'Leisav L'Folam, that the Eibush is turning the wheel, and like you said, Eisen, that he establishes generations and puts people on this earth, and then if people think, that, like you said, the Iskaiman, that they will live forever because they just take their lives for granted, it says, Inun uvdin kutshibrichu mahapachlan. The Eibishter then shows, and he responds. What do you see from this? That there's a direct engagement between existence and God. That God runs the show. It's not like he created the world and do whatever you like. No, your actions have consequences. So the Zohar is talking based on the Pasuk in Iyov, how God manages and supervises. Now he does this through his angels and through his messengers. Like I said, just like a king, if the city behaves in a way that deserves reward, God, the king will send a reward through his ambassadors. If the city does something that upsets the king or deserves retribution or deserves some form of judgment, the king will send his messengers to do that. So the king is running the show. That's clear. But he does it through these different methods, and that's what the Zohar is talking about. It's not. He's still going to explain further. Okay. Continue now the language of the Zohar. Begin, because the high Tiklah, is Tachlis Kameh. Okay, Tiklah is a wheel, a galgal. In Aramaic, Tiklah is a wheel. Is Tachlis Kameh. So the explanation is, like he says the next words, but let me just say, Istachus Maneh is from the word Seicher. It means it's like the potter's wheel, that when he shapes a pot, when he shapes a earthenware, or other things that a potter does with his wheel, so it's like a Seicher. It's the craft of the wheel. That's Istachus Kameh. Tiklah hu hagalgal. Tiklah is the wheel. That the worker, the craftsman, uses to shape klei cheres, earthenware. So if you don't have a potter's wheel, you take, let's say, raw clay or other material, and the potter's clay helps shape it into a pot, into a cup, into a plate, or whatever it may be. So Tiklah is an expression from the Zohar explaining what it means, the wheel. Since it says Misapich, and he says Mesabif Sevuvim, so he's giving an example for it. As a matter of fact, this is, we say it every Yom Kippur when we say Kihine Kachemer B'Yada Yetzer, right? Like just like Chemer, the matter in the Yada Yetzer, in the hand of the craftsman, the Yetzer, the one that's shaping it, so too are we in your hands, in God's hands. You shape us this way, you shape us that way. So in other words, we see here the interaction of the Yetzer, the craftsman, with existence is like the potter or the craftsman, the potter using the wheel to shape and and create different forms and shapes. Okay, so that's the Zohar. And so you see from this that it's not coming from a detached place. All these examples are very much a serious engagement. When a potter is using a potter's wheel to shape a keli, some earthenware, he's involved, he's engaged in it in detail to shape it. The Mittler Rebbe, when he explains this idea, he says that everything is being done by the craftsman, which in this case is God. However, the changes don't happen in the potter, the changes happen in the keli and happen in the wheel. That's where all this is taking place. So it's not ever, so the shinui is not happening in the source, the shinui is happening in how God shapes it. So he's going to explain now. And the example of this above is as follows. Malchus datzilus. This is the level, Tiklah, that he just said, is the wheel that he's referring to is Malchus of Atzilus. It is the source that is creates all the creations of Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya. And energizes and sustain and energizes them. You, Machaya, you energize, you create, you give life to everything. As kulam. So Zeo B'chinas Ha'esius, what is the specific? These are the letters. The B'chinas Dibura Elyon Hamahava Machaya. These are the letters of the supernal speech of the divine. When God says, Yehi Oir, Yehi Rakia, we learned earlier, B'dvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu. God didn't just create, He used words. And the words are very shaped. The words are made up of details. We learned at length how the words of speech articulate and create tangible channels. Asa, from the Oisius, if you remember, Asa Baker, it transmits and draws down the energy in very clear channels of these letters. So he says that's the Oisius of Malchus of Atzilus. That's Hamahava Machaya, that create or bring into being and Machaya and give life to everything in existence. So obviously, Ata Machayas Kulam is referring to the source. There's only one creator. But how does the creator do it? He does it through Malchus of Atzilus. Harizeh Nikra Tiklah. This is called Tiklah, the wheel. The potter's wheel, which just the Zohar refers to. The Kutche Brichu, when we say, the Zohar says, Kutche Brichu Mesaviv Sivuvim. So he says, Kutche Brichu. Who is the level of Kutche Brichu? Hu B'chinas Ein Sof HaMelubish B'Zod Atzilus. Kutche Brichu is referring to the infinite divine light that manifests in the Mides, in the Zohar of Atzilus. The Kavanas HaMaimer, and the intention of the Maimer in the Zohar, what's the Zohar coming to add? Hu Shabola Farish is coming to explain an obvious question. Shemepi Elyon Leiseitza Hareyas Chaz v'Shalom. From the mouth above, from God's mouth, the supernal mouth, Elyon, God forbid, no evil can come from there, because God is completely good. Going back to Eov, what was Eov's complaint to God? He's saying, why is all this evil coming from you? How could you do this to me? One of the answers, one of the key points to remember is that klal, at all. No evil can come from above. Because evil does not does not come close to you. There's no ra in that domain in God, in the divine level. As the sages tell us, evil does not come from above. Rather, who is Baruch, God may be blessed, who mokeratev v'ametiv lakel. He's the source of good and does good to all. So therefore, the question emerges, so how is there evil in this world? And that's what the Biyuri Azer comes to answer, that the Zohar is coming to address that issue. We'll soon get to the answer, but that's so far what he said. I just want to see the parentheses is not a short one. But I think we have to read it because I think it's directly relevant to this theme here. Just want to see what's after the parentheses. And he's not going to come back to the so-called, question, so-called explanation until further down. So just let's bear, we have to go through this a little slowly. So far he said that what's the intention of the Zohar? Is to come to explain that since and evil does not come from above, only good, he's going to be explaining where then does Gevurah come from? Where then does evil come from? Or negative stuff come from? But let's read the parentheses and then we'll come back. You'll see the whole context. The Tzorech Leimer, that when we say that God is good, totally good, Tzorech Leimer, that this is referring to the level of Erein Sof that's higher than Atzilus. Before he was saying Kudshe Brichu is Erein Sof that manifests in Zav Atzilus. So now we're referring to Erein Sof that's higher than Atzilus. Bechinas Erein Sof habligvul, the infinite divine light. Shurak bechinas Chesed v'Teiv. That level is only kindness and goodness. Bechinas v'Rav Chesed da'arech hampik, or the Erech HaPayim. Like we say, Rav Chesed, the abundant Chesed, kindness of the level of Erech HaPayim or Arech Hampin, which is higher. This is in Keser, higher than Atzilus. V'agam de ba'arech Hampin, yesh b'chinas Gevurah gamkein. And even though in Arech Hampin, which is the lower level of Keser, there's also Gevurah, we know there's Chesed and Gevurah. Yesh leimer shahari b'chinas hamid is the Arech Hampin, ein b'chinas mitzias nikeres. We can say that the midas and Arech Hampin, since it's in a supraconscious state, they have not yet become, the midas have not yet become formed in a mitzias nikeres, in an obviously a discernible state of being. It's still in an amorphous, almost in a quantum-like state. Not nikeres, it's not yet discernible, and also hasn't yet been distinguished, hasn't yet broken down. Similar to what I explained when you say about a seed. Even though the cell has all the potential in it, but it's not yet been broken into details. The cell is not split yet. And in general, this level is Gili Eir, it's just a revelation of light. And one that does not yet have defined parameters. It's Ein Sof and Bligvul, relatively speaking, remember, always. Because there's always Atik and there's always higher levels. But relative to Atzilus, we don't yet have shaped spheres. Imkain harizeh b'chinas Chesed. So if that's the case, even though there's Gevurah there, but the Gevurah has not yet become shaped and it's not yet been broken down into Gevurah, so everything is all in the category of revelation, which is a level of Chesed. Chesed, we learned before, is Gili, revelation. V'yashlemer, another Yashlemer, the Rebbe Rashab adds, V'yashlemer, we can say, the Dugma, it's like example, Kamoy ba'erein sof kaidem atzimtzum. Even though this is, we're talking about Kaidem Atzilus, not Kaidem Atzimtzum, but he says similar. Keser is similar to the way it is before the Tzimtzum. Before the Tzimtzum, before the concealment, what was dominating there? What was the only present consciousness? Was divine consciousness, Erein Sof HaBligvul. And even the Hamer Begoliah, the Isis HaRishima, and even the Rishima that would come afterwards, the trace of these letters would only emerge after the concealment. But the letters before the Tzimtzum are completely submerged in the Erein Sof. Eishes Harashima, if you recall earlier, refers to God envisioning existence, where he says, "Bereishim menusa demalka goliv galifu bereshima betihiri ilah." So that's called the Eishes Harashima before the Tzimtzum. The power of the finite in Ein Sof, but it's completely submerged within the power of the infinite because the Tzimtzum didn't happen yet. It's like if the artist envisioning a particular piece of art, but still it's part of all his infinite possibilities. So that's the state before the Tzimtzum. And the actual power of the finite was not at all obvious. Like he said, it wasn't discernible. There, everything was just an expression of an infinite divine field of energy. So he's comparing Arich Ampin, even though there's Gevurah there, but he said the Gevurah is not yet shaped, so it's like similar to the Koyach HaGvul before the Tzimtzum. That's the example here. The Makol Mokim, another parenthesis within the parentheses. And nevertheless, even before the Tzimtzum, Yesh B'zeh Chilukim Adreigis, we learned earlier that before the Tzimtzum, there's also different levels. Like the level where it arose in his desire, which is already God desiring existence. The level prior to that, where he doesn't yet desire existence, he's beyond it. A higher level, the Etzem, that's not even a form of revelation yet. It's just Etzem, the potential for Eir. And he went even further. He went Shmaya Atzmi all the way to Helam Atzmi. He doesn't mention that here because it's not relevant. And in all these levels, there are Asius. Like we learned earlier, page 1419 and 1420, that they're letters. But the letters there, if you remember, the higher you go, the letters become less and less distinct. It's like the letters in thought are not as tangible as the letters in speech. The letters in previous Abina, if you remember, even less or Pnimius HaMachshava, even less distinct. The letters all the way in the Nefesh, all the way, if you remember, Nefesh, Mole Asius, the Nefesh itself also has letters, but they're not definable yet. They're just potential. Like we just said, the potential of Gvul. But it's not yet actual discernible and distinct level of Gvul. So this is all before the Tzimtzum. And he's saying, just as it is before the Tzimtzum, that there are letters, but the letters are all submerged. And it's all one, what you're seeing and what is being expressed is only Eir Ein Sof. He says the same thing is with Keser. Arich Ampin. Even though there's Gevurah there, but it's not yet Nicker, and it hasn't yet been broken down into Gevurah, so it's all Chesed, all Gili, all Eir. And he brings further proof for this. Not further proof, further detail in this proof. And it's known what it says in Teira Dibra Masel Pasach Aliyo. In the Maimer Pasach Aliyo, that's the same Maimer that he referred to earlier, Yodea Yodua. The Keser Bechlal, that Keser in general, who Kamoy B'chinas Erein Sof Shalifnei Tzimtzum. That Keser in general is like Erein Sof before the Tzimtzum. In general terms, everything higher than Atzil is considered in the category of Lifnei Tzimtzum. So based on this, he says in Teireh that he compares Keser to Lifnei Tzimtzum. And Lifnei Tzimtzum, we know, though there's a Koyach HaGvul, but it's completely part of the Eir HaGvul. So therefore we can say the Gam B'chinas Arich Ampin, that also on the level of Arich Ampin, which is in Keser, Shagvura Eina Nikar Klal. The Gevurah, which is similar to Koyach HaGvul, the limit, the Gevurah is not yet discernible. Or it's not discernible, period. Not yet. It's not discernible. V'akol b'chinas Gili, everything there is a form of revelation. Shezeh b'chinas Chesed V'teiv. That's the level of kindness and goodness. So goodness and kindness is a revelation, a divine revelation. When there's lack of goodness or kindness, is because the divine is concealed. And that's not yet emerged before Atzilus, like it doesn't emerge before the Tzimtzum. It's only a dugma, but it's there. For Kolshkein Bechinas Atik. If this is the case with Arich Ampin, Arich in Keser, for sure Atik in Keser, which is even higher than Arich. The less smaller Bahayatika, where it says explicitly, there's no small, there's no left, there's no Gevurah in Atik. Let me go a few more lines to the end of the parentheses and then I'll stop. Omnam. So then, of course, now comes this. He said before the parentheses that Kutsha Brichu is Ein Sof that manifests in Zod Atzilus. Now he said that we have to, and one second, yeah. And then he said that the idea of Ein Ra Yered Momaila, that there's no such thing as negative energy coming from above, is referring to, in the parentheses, Ein Sof, higher than Atzilus. What about Zod Atzilus? Remember, it said Kutshe Brichu, he's the one that is Besab of Sibis, he's the one that's turning the wheel. So now he adds, Omnam, however, Gamba Atzilus, the Zah, who b'chinas Chesed Gevurah. So now when you get to Zah of Atzilus here, we can't say Gevurah doesn't exist. Because Zah we described is absolutely distinct spheres. There's a distinct sphere called Chesed and one called Gevurah. Even there, where Gevurah has now become a defined entity, it's still the Iker. The primary driving force in Atzilus is Chsadim, kindness. So Kumesha Kosov, Kizecher or Zecher, Kizecher Chasde, which is a proof in Chassidus that Chesed is the dominant feature even in Atzilus. Higher than Atzilus for sure, as you just explained, but also in Atzilus. V'zeu, why is that the case? The hein misada ein sof shalamayla Atzilus. 1 second, no, let me correct. That's not the tone. So v'zeu, and now he concludes. So we know now the hein mitzad ein sof shalamayla Atzilus, both from the perspective of infinite divine light higher than Atzilus. The hein mitzad b'chinas eser spheres d'Atzilus, and also from the 10 spheres of Atzilus, the Eibishter is hu b'chinas ateva meitiv. He is good and bestows good, which is all coming to explain what the Zohar wants to teach us. So then the question, of course, is, so where's their negative energy altogether? If from above nothing is coming negative, it's all Chesed. Higher than Atzilus, only Gilui. Even in Atzilus, Chesed and Gevurah, Chesed is the dominant feature. So he says after the parentheses, I just don't want to leave this hanging. It's only b'asusa delotata of shalahem, which apparently means us, from people, human beings, our work from below, that we stimulate and we awaken and we draw down upon our. It doesn't say us; he says them. Aleim, dinin v'gvuras, judgments and severities. Rahman al-Islam, heaven protect us. Milmaila, from above. To the point that through an extensive evolution of ishtalshlus, step by step, nasa b'chinas ra gomur lamato. This energy will ultimately become ra gomur, complete negative, complete evil below. So even though God created Tzimtzum and God creates the Gevurah, we know that, but in the higher levels, Gevurah and Tzimtzum are all part of God's expression. So therefore, they're all part of Chesed. It's only through our actions and through our Ribu Yishtalshus that our actions that stimulates the negative part that can come, that stimulates a Gevurah that should actually take on the shape that is not positive, like similar to the example that a father hides from his child in order to elicit the ingenuity of the child to find his father, but then the child gives up looking, stops looking. So what happens? The concealment, which was meant to be part of the chesed, part of the kindness of the father trying to provoke his child to find him, has now become the source of pain. Because the child thinks that the father is no longer there, and he gives up looking, and he stops looking, and that the misunderstood concealment becomes the root of all problems, because you think God is no longer there. So now I'm on my own, and one person could hurt another, and then all the injustices that are possible are only because the tzimtzum was misunderstood. And we were given, of course, the free will to be able to act on that. I'm going to discuss this a lot more, and it's going to continue, I see. He brings the Medrash. There's much more to say on this topic, because this isn't a small matter. We can't just pass by. He says that evil doesn't come from above, then we want to know where it comes from. But he's definitely saying that the Zohar comes to address this, and in Biyuri Azeh, he elaborates on this. Here it's briefer, but basically the summation of what I just said is the key thing to remember. That from above, it's a purely gili of elikus. It's only below where it's possible that we misunderstand, and our actions should create a situation that would create gvuras and dinim that are actually a divine concealment, and ultimately that will evolve into or devolve into Ra Gomer. We'll talk about this more. I just want to, first of all, time I see, and secondly, I wanted to stop if anybody wants to ask any questions. If it's questions about how evil comes, I will elaborate on that more, but obviously I won't censor anybody, so please take it away. I'll probably stop here anyway, even though he's in the middle of a subject here, but let's stop here. Go ahead. Any questions? It's a heavy, long piece here. So just to sum up, there's a few things that were stated here that we shouldn't conflate them. The first thing is coming to explain why the Shinu is in Malchus, and explains Malchus is Tiklah, is the potter's wheel that shapes and defines things, as he brought from the Zohar, he runs the show and manages the earth, manages events on this earth based on our behavior, as he brought from the Der HaMabul. That's point number one. That's Malchus Datzilus. And then he went on to say, but he didn't fully finish, that what's Kutshibrichu, who is turning this wheel, he said that's Elikus, Ein Sof, that manifests in Zod Datzilus. And then he said, and that's what the Zohar is coming to explain. How all this happens, because on one hand, we say Mipi Elyon, that Ra doesn't come from above. The only place it comes from is from Atachtain. But he didn't finish the topic, so what is Kutshabricha then? What does it mean that he's turning the wheel? So most likely he's saying is that he's turning the wheel in response to us, to our actions. Ma'aseh Tachteinim is Negeya, as he said, it touches Malchus, the level of the wheel. So the wheel spins, and in turn produces Gevurah instead of Chesed. That's Mishapich. Like you said from the Pasuk, Mishapich b'tach b'leisav l'folam. But it's coming through our actions, not from above. Our actions, in turn, generate the different energies that come. As he explains in Biyuri Azeh, like Rosh Hashanah, when our merits can draw down the Chesadim, and our lack of merits, our transgressions, draw down Gevurah's dinim. But it's not affecting levels that are higher than Malchus in a direct way, even though the Ashpah comes from there. The effect is in Malchus Datzilus. That's where the wheel is turning. That's where the Shinuyim happen, in the shaping of the Klei Cheres, in the shaping of the flow of the Ashpah that goes through Malchus into existence. That's what we learned so far. But as I said, needs a lot more to unpack. But I'll stop again before we conclude. Any questions? Anything you wanted me to clarify?
In the beginning of the third volume, Rabbi, in the beginning of third volume, remember we extensively talked about the whole concept of Keren Zavius, and the whole fact that Malchus did not have any creative powers at all, and it was just a memutza, a interface. So now he's saying that it has those powers. How do you reconcile the two?
There are many different things in Malchus. I don't think it's there are parts of Malchus, less lamagar, more klum, doesn't have energy of its own. It's like the moon. But once it receives the light from above, it has a functionality. Malchus has It's not just from what you learned earlier. Malchus has a full functional purpose. Malchus doesn't have any energy of its own. It's like a state, like the moon that receives its light from the sun. But Malchus has 10 spheres in it, and there's all kinds of functionality going on in Malchus. This is a big part of Kabbalah and Chassidus.
I was going to ask, so if everything, the wheel turns and everything happens because of our actions, then what is the mechanism for like reversing or,
Well, we haven't even finished the mechanism of the turns.
All right. Sorry.
And then we'll get there. Then
Okay.
it's the same mechanism, because just as we can transgress, we can do tshuva and we can repair, and then in turn draw down different energies from above, just as a brief response. It's not a one-way street here. It's an evolving process. Throughout history, there are things that happen that the wheel turns a certain way, then it turns a different way. Chesed, Gevurah. But ultimately, it says, Yisrael Eishen Tshuva Miyadei Nagon, we will experience total tshuva and total geula. That's also part of the wheel's process. But he hasn't spelled that out. But that is going to be the ultimate picture here. Right now, the goal is discussing this engagement, where the divine engages with us. And he's comparing it to this wheel.
What is the source for Ki Zachar Chasto? You said there's a proof that God is only good, or He only means well. Three
different
Where
proofs.
can I find that?
He said, one second. The proof that God is good, he brought from above. And then he brought Le'igurcha and Ein Ra Yered Mumayla. That's the proof that there's no evil from above. Zecher Chazdei was saying that even in Zav Atzilus, with his Chesed and Gevurah, what dominates is Chesed. It's in the Siddur. It's not the. That's just saying that in the world of Chesed and Gevurah, Chesed is the dominant one. Zecher Chazdei, and you can look in the Siddur Imdach, the Siddur of the Mittler Rebbe, on that tefillah. Zecher Chazdei, I believe it's in Ashrei, where he says, where he explains it in other places. You just have to look through again, if you go to Sefer Likutim, probably Chesed, in the entry on Chesed, it'll probably bring it. But remember, that's a proof only that Zecher Chazdei, that Chesed dominates in Atzilus.
Atzilus. So, not quick, but follow-up question. Not coming here, God forbid, to negate the Rebbe Rashab. He knows better than I do, obviously, but he brings the raya, the leish smala b'hayatika. Okay, but that's fine enough. From the Zohar, we can understand that. But he talks about and Atzilus, and he says essentially the same. There's no Gevurah there, but that's not what the Zohar says. The Zohar says there's no Gevurah. Well, let's put it this way: there's no restrictive type of Gevurah in Atik. We know there is 10 spheres in Atik. It's just the Gevurah is tagboras. It's an abundance of goodness. So it's a different kind of Gevurah. But anyways, but the inyan of the Leismal Bahayatika, that's true for Atik, but it's not true between below Atik and above Atzilus. So
with all due respect, what he's saying is that even in Atzilus, where there is Gevurah, in Atik there's no Gevurah. Less smaller Bahayatika, there's no Gevurah. In Atzilus there is Gevurah. There's 10 spheres. One of them is called Gevurah. That's clear. That's not a question. What dominates in Atzilus, what is the dominating energy, is the energy of Chesed. It's a completely different thing. It has nothing to do with Atik. Atik is, even Arechi said the Gevurah has now taken shape. In Atzilus it's taken shape. There's a full midah called Gevurah. Like, for example, think of a very kind person. He also has Gevurah in him. But what dominates in his life, what's the primary force you see is kindness. Avram had Gevurah, like everyone has 10 faculties. So it's a very different discussion. In Atik, there's no Gevurah altogether. It's completely submerged, or however you explain it, in Atik. And in Arich also he said it does not nikar, not ischalkus, like the Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. In Atzilus there is Gevurah. But still, nevertheless, the words he uses, that in Atzilus, he says, Gam B'Atzilus, that we discussed the Gevurah, the Ikar of Atzilus in general, including the Gevurah of Atzilus, what dominates there is Chesed, that it's like the Gevurah Sheba Chesed, whereas in lower levels, Gevurah becomes a much more dominant feature as real judgment and real severities. He actually spoke about this earlier, if you recall. We spoke about the Gevurahs as they come down below, they're very Gevurahs cautious, very severe judgments. In Atzilus, they're very subtle. And then they get even more subtle as they go up in the source. So it's all different ways of how we explain the nullification of Gevurah.
Thank you.
Okay. So we'll
Rabbi?
stop here. So any other question?
Yeah, Rabbi, I believe I heard the rabbi mention that the Knesset Yisrael is associated with Malchus of Atzilus. So is the Rebbe Rashab going to talk more about that, how that actually comes into play, Knesset Yisrael, which I think...
I could refer you where he explained it at length is in the beginning of volume 2 in Ayin Beis. I don't believe he's going to go back there because he already discussed it really at length in early
2.
pages of volume 2.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
You explained that Malchus of Atzilus, in Atzilus is like Knesset Yisrael. In Biyah, in Malchus as it comes into Biyah, that's like Shoshana, like Mislapshus, Shoshana, like he spoke about the rose. Okay, we're middle of the subject. It's not over yet. You see, continues with the Medrash. Yeah, this is going to be a good another few pages that's going to explain all of this. So we'll stop here, a few lines, 3 lines from the bottom of page 1429.